Pete Townshend said it like he was stating the weather. Not cruel about it, just certain. You're a studio ghost, Jeff. You're incredible in there, no argument. But guitar only matters when 10,000 people feel it. That's where the real test is. It was the autumn of 1967. The room was someone's flat in Kensington, the kind of place musicians ended up after midnight when the pubs closed and nobody wanted to go home yet. There were maybe 20 people there, some of them famous, some of them just trying to be. Townshend was already a star by then. The Who had torn through Britain and America, playing shows that left audiences shaken. He'd smashed guitars on stages from London to New York. He'd written My Generation. He'd turned the electric guitar into a weapon in a sermon, sometimes in the same song. He had opinions and he was comfortable with them. Beck was there too, quieter, always quieter. He'd been standing near the window when Townshend said it. Glass of wine in one hand, not really part of any particular conversation. Just present the way Beck was always present in rooms like that. Close enough to be there, far enough to be somewhere else entirely. The Jeff Beck group had just started forming, though they hadn't played a real show yet. Beck had left the Yardbirds earlier that year, and what he was building now was still more idea than reality. He was assembling something. Nobody knew quite what yet, including him. Townshend wasn't trying to be dismissive. That much was clear to the people in the room. He was making a point about music, about what he believed. He believed in the crowd. He believed the audience was the third instrument, the thing that turned performance into something alive. Without them, it was just technique, just a man in a room with a guitar. Beck didn't argue. He didn't say anything. He picked up a glass from the table next to him and looked somewhere else. Some people in the room watched to see what would happen next. Nothing did. The conversation moved on. The party moved on. Someone put a record on. Someone opened another bottle. Beck set his glass down at some point and slipped out, and most people didn't notice when he left. A few did. They noticed the way you notice when a sound stops. Not quite sure when it happened, only sure that something is different now. 3 days later, Keith Moon was at a rehearsal space in Soho. He wasn't supposed to be there. He'd come to drop something off for the building manager, something mundane, an errand. The hallway smelled like cigarettes and old carpet. Moon was in a good mood, which meant he was loud about it. Then he heard a guitar. It was coming from behind a door at the end of the corridor. No amplifier, no effects, just a guitar, unplugged, played so quietly that Moon had to stop walking to be sure he wasn't imagining it. The playing wasn't fast. It wasn't showing off. It moved the way water moves when nobody's watching it, the way a conversation sounds when the people having it have forgotten you can hear them. It climbed up something and came back down, and each note sounded like it had somewhere to be. Moon pushed the door open. Jeff Beck was sitting on a wooden chair in the middle of an empty room. No audience, no band, no equipment beyond the guitar in his lap, and the small notebook on the floor beside him, open to a blank page. He didn't look up when Moon came in. He didn't stop playing. Moon stood in the doorway for a second. Then he sat down on the floor, cross-legged, back against the wall, like he'd been invited and had simply taken a while to arrive. He didn't say a word. Beck played for 20 minutes, maybe more. Moon never counted. He just sat there while Beck moved through something that had no name and no audience and didn't seem to need either. There were moments when the guitar sounded like it was asking something. There were moments when it sounded like it already knew the answer and was only playing the question for the pleasure of the shape it made. The room was cold. Moon didn't notice until it was over. When Beck finally stopped, there was a long silence. Beck looked down at the strings. Moon looked at his own hands in his lap. "Who is that for?" Moon asked. Beck looked up at him, a small shrug, like the question hadn't fully occurred to him before. "No one," Beck said. "Just working something out." Moon sat there another minute. Then he stood up, said nothing else, and left. He went straight to Townshend. He found him at their rehearsal space in Battersea, in the middle of something unrelated, and he interrupted without apologizing. That wasn't unusual. Moon interrupted things regularly. What was unusual was the way he looked when he did it. "I heard Beck today," Moon said. Townshend looked up from what he was doing. "Heard him play. Just him, no amp, nobody in the room except me walking in by accident." Townshend waited. Pete. Moon paused. He was looking for the right words, which was genuinely unusual for him. Moon was many things, but careful with language wasn't typically one of them. I've never heard anything like that. Townshend didn't respond right away. He knew Moon. He knew how rarely Moon used a quiet voice. He wasn't playing for anyone, Moon said. Just for himself. Just to work something out, he said. There was a long moment between them. And it was the best guitar playing I've ever heard in my life. Moon said it without drama, just flat and honest, the way Moon was when he actually meant something, when the noise fell away, and what was left was just the thing itself. It made me feel like I'd been standing in a corridor the whole time, like everything I've ever heard was somewhere outside the real thing, just adjacent to it. Townshend didn't say anything. Moon looked at him for a moment, then left. Townshend sat in the rehearsal room for a while afterward, not playing, not moving, just sitting with it. He'd said guitar only matters when 10,000 people feel it. He'd meant it. He still did in a way. But Moon said it made him feel like he'd been standing in a corridor, like everything outside that room was somehow less real than what was happening inside it. That was something Townshend hadn't considered when he'd been talking in that Kensington flat. He didn't bring it up with Beck. Not that week, not that month. The two of them moved in the same circles. London in 1967 was small enough that certain musicians kept running into each other, whether they planned to or not. They'd end up at the same clubs, the same sessions, the same late-night places where the same people always gathered because they had nowhere better to be and didn't want to admit they liked each other's company. Townshend watched Beck sometimes. Not obviously, just noticed him. There was something about the way Beck existed in a room. Not invisible exactly, but not present in the way that Townshend was present. Townshend walked into rooms and the room knew it, felt it, reorganized itself accordingly. Beck walked in and the room sort of arranged itself around him without knowing why, like a temperature change you feel before you understand where it's coming from. He thought about what Moon had said. He thought about it more than he expected to. The thing that kept coming back was the notebook on the floor, open to a blank page. Beck had been working something out that didn't need to be written down, or maybe it was something that couldn't be. The music was the note. The playing was the thought. There was no version of it that existed outside the moment it was being made. Townshend had always written things down, songs, ideas, arguments, manifestos. He'd always believed that the point of making something was to make it permanent, to get it in front of people, to have it land and leave a mark. Beck was doing something different. Beck was making something that dissolved the moment it was finished, with no one there to receive it, and somehow that had been the best guitar playing Keith Moon had ever heard. Townshend didn't know what to do with that. The Jeff Beck group played their first proper shows in early 1968, with Rod Stewart on vocals and Ronnie Wood on bass. What they did on stage was extraordinary in patches, disorganized in others, occasionally transcendent, occasionally a complete mess. Beck seemed almost indifferent to which it was on any given night. He played the same whether the crowd was with him or not, which is exactly what bothered Townshend, and exactly what he couldn't stop thinking about, because Beck's music didn't need anything. Not approval, not response, not the electricity of a crowd pushing back at you from across a stage. It existed on its own terms, complete, indifferent to reception in a way that Townshend, who had spent his entire career feeding off audiences, could never quite understand and never quite dismiss. He had built his whole career on the opposite belief. The guitar mattered because of the audience made it real. Without them, it was just a man in a room. But Moon had sat on the floor of that room. Moon, who had played in some of the most electric, violent, glorious shows British rock had ever produced. Moon had sat there listening to Beck play for no one, with nothing at stake, and come away feeling like the corridors of his entire career were somewhere adjacent to a thing he'd only just glimpsed. Keith Moon died in September 1978. Townshend carried that conversation with him after that. The way Moon had said it flat, the way the noise had dropped out of him for just a moment. The best guitar playing I've ever heard in my life. He'd said it once, never repeated it. That was how Moon worked. When something genuinely landed, he said it once and left it there. No performance around it, just the thing itself. It came back at strange times. Not always when Townshend was thinking about music. Sometimes just when things were quiet. In the spring of 2003, Townshend did a long interview for a music magazine. The conversation moved through the Who's history, through the losses and the survival, and the strange shape of a career that had lasted decades past when it probably should have ended. Near the end, the interviewer asked about other guitarists. Who had surprised him most across all those years? Townshend was quiet for a moment. Beck, he said. The interviewer waited. I told Jeff once that guitar only matters when an audience feels it. I believe that. I still believe a version of it. He stopped. But a long time ago, I heard something through a mutual friend. Beck playing alone in a room. No one there, no amp, nothing. Just working something out, he said. Another pause. The person who heard it said it was the greatest guitar playing they'd experienced in their life. He looked at the interviewer. That person was Keith Moon, who had seen everything, who had been part of more extraordinary nights than most musicians ever dream about. And what Beck did in that room, for no one, with nothing at stake. Townshend stopped again, chose the next word carefully. It mattered, more than most things I've done in front of 10,000 people. He didn't say Beck was the best, didn't reach for any of the big words people use when they want to make something sound larger than it is. He just said mattered, from Pete Townshend in 2003, 36 years after a flat in Kensington where he'd been so certain about something. That word, that was enough.